To get us all kind of in the space of thinking more about education through the lens of children's human rights, I wanted to talk a wee bit about some of the work that Children's Parliament together and SYP have been doing around education reform, as well as just kind of have a broader look at what we might mean by that lived experience of a rights-based education. Only one slide about us. This is what we kind of dream, that children grow up in a world of love, happiness and understanding, and we want to use the power of the UNCRC to make a difference in children's lives. We say that's about us, but actually I guess it's about most people or everybody on the call today. Right, we're going to jump in right into the middle of this now. So you may know that Article 28 of the Convention gives the right to education, but it's in Article 29 that we really kind of get into the meat of what that experience of education should be like. So what I wanted to do is to try and focus on that to some extent. Now, at Children's Parliament, we don't kind of present articles generally to children. That's not really a great approach. We wouldn't see children in our work reading an article out loud or whatever. But for us adults with responsibilities, for us duty bearers, it's really important that we understand what the Convention says. And as everybody on the call will know, these are basic entitlements. So, you know, it's the floor, not the ceiling. This is the way it should be, and this will be enshrined in law when that is all the current issues are resolved. So that's impending. It's not a cliff edge. It's all this a bit of jargon again, but it's that kind of progressive realization. It's about getting there together. But what we need to do is actually to focus on where we need to be now, as well as where we want to be soon. So Article 29, and something that's mentioned at the bottom here, general comment number 1. This all looks a bit kind of heavy going, but actually general comment number 1, the aims of education, is a really beautifully written piece, and it explains what Article 29 means. If you read it, it really gives a flavour of the kind of educational experience that I'm sure everybody on the call would want for the children and young people that they work with, or their own sons, daughters, nieces, nephews. It's that kind of real clarification about what it should be like to go to school, to go to early learning in Scotland today. So we're going to do something completely unscientific. And what I'm going to do is, I'm just going to, not to labour the point, but what I want you to do is to give Scottish education as it is a bit of a score. So I'm going to ask you, when I've finished, to pop a mark out of 25 in the chat. So when I read out a section, add up in your head. Number 1 is a bit rubbish. We're really nowhere near this. Number 5 would be, we're absolutely delivering on that in the experience of schools and learning in Scotland. Yeah, okay. I'm going to do this because I'm going to tell you what children and young people have told us recently. So Scottish education at the minute is all about the development of the child's personality, talents and mental and physical abilities to their fullest potential. Score out of 5. It's also about the development of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms and for the principles enshrined in the Charter of the UN Nations. So for the national values of the country in which the child is living, the country from which he or she may originate, and for civilizations different from his or her own. The biggie. Part D, how are we doing in Scotland? Are we preparing the child for responsible life in a free society in the spirit of understanding, peace, tolerance, equality of sexes and friendship among all peoples, ethnic, national and religious groups and persons of Indigenous origin? And finally, how are we doing in terms of the development of respect for the natural environment? So you probably know that Professor Ken Muir was charged with a task of what's broadly called education reform. And he was given this job because we knew that some of the big beasts of Scottish education needed reform. So the government had already committed to replacing the SQA, and they also wanted to look at Education Scotland and its role and its job. So as you know, Education Scotland is about supporting improvement in the system, and it's also where you'll find the inspectorate. So he was given that job, but what he decided also, probably a wee bit out of the scope that maybe Scottish Government thought he had, was to look at broadly the educational context, because you can't reform the bodies within Scottish education unless you actually understand the process, the experience of education. So it was a bit quick, but we did our best together. Children's Parliament and SYP engaged with children and young people. For primary school age children, we created these toolkits that adults known to them could work with them on the experience of school and learning. Similarly, for secondary school age and young people at college, there was a toolkit. And then for 12 to 18-year-olds, we had a survey, which got quite a large response. So that's how we try to engage with children and young people, as well as looking back at our body of work ourselves so that we could bring that to the piece. So what we did was, well, one of the things is we created a number of statements, a few of which I'll tell you about today, but we tried to create some statements that children and young people could comment on based on the elements of Article 29. So this was our first go at this. It's not perfect, but it was a way to try and get children and young people to talk about where they're at now in terms of their right as the purposes of education as described in the Convention. So these were 7 of the statements that we put to children and young people, and I'll rattle through them now just to give you a flavour. So the scores are coming in, so we're not looking at, they're not great, are they? So I think where you're at might be reflected in what we're about to hear from children and young people. What I'll do is I'll just read the top. I'll let you take a moment to read the comments, which come from the qualitative bit. The diagram on the pie chart on the left comes from the 12 to 18-year-old survey. But this is some findings around my education helps me to develop my personality, talents and abilities to their fullest potential. I'll give you a moment. So what you'll see in the slides that are coming is a fairly consistent pattern in terms of the pie chart on the left for 12 to 18-year-olds. Now, what's interesting, if you work with this scale, you know, the Likert scale from strongly agree through to strongly disagree, I would say in my experience of using this kind of approach, it's quite rare to have such a huge number of respondents bumping for neutral. It's not normally where people find themselves. And this is where it will sit through all the results I'm giving you. Now, that could mean several things, of course. It could mean that children and young people are just not sure where their education sits. Now, it doesn't mean I don't know. It could just be, I'm not sure where it sits in terms of this statement. Maybe this statement is relatively new to me, so I'm not quite sure as I think about it, whether this is something I'm experiencing. Or it could be a bit, you know, Scottish education for me is just, it's neither. It's neither one way or the other, and that's not a particularly good place to be. So, as you can see, we're talking about just over 50% of 12 to 18-year-olds agreed to some extent with the statement. My education helps me develop respect for human rights and freedoms. The bottom quote there in secondary school, that's, you know, this is not just about education about rights, which is, I think, what a lot of children and young people get. Actually, it's about that lived experience, about the person's rights being respected. This is a class, I mean, that I think that last quote on the right hand side, I could have written that when I was at school a lifetime ago. You know, these are things that are not shifting for some children and young people, and that's absolutely not okay. My education helps me to develop respect for my parents, carers, my cultural identity and language. A slight editing of the part of the Convention. So again, that pattern, around 50%-ish of children and young people aged 12 to 18 agreeing that we're successfully delivering on the commitments that we make through Article 29. And that information here from SYP Learner Panel. So these are young people who are absolutely steeped in discussion about their educational experiences. My education prepares me for a responsible life in a free society in the spirit of understanding, peace and tolerance. A real sense of what we got from the feedback, the qualitative and the quantitative, is just this lack of enthusiasm, I suppose, for, you know, are our children and young people energized? Are they loving their experience? Or do they feel that it's really fundamentally about them and their rights and their well-being? And it's just not coming through. It's a kind of a bland kind of response, if you like. It's quite worrying for me that it lacks a whole energy when those kind of experiences of school and learning should be the place where all of these things should be your day-to-day experience. This is an interesting one. We did a lot of work along with others at Children's Parliament through the build-up to COP26, and that was a huge opportunity. So actually, I think the results here are probably better than they might have been had we not hosted COP26. Children's Parliament is also about to publish some work around learning for sustainability, investigating that with children, and that'll be published later this month, I hope. So again, we'll see whether we're delivering in detail through the curriculum on this stuff. This was really interesting that most of the qualitative feedback was people didn't actually know what these things were. So it's really interesting that people don't know what our national values are, and everybody in the call might have a different idea about what they are. But it does mean it's something, it's enshrined in the convention that we really need to be thinking about. So yeah, this slide, these last two of the pie charts, these are not necessarily connected, well, they're not connected to Article 29 as such, but I just wanted to give you a flavour of some quite bold statement and where our children and young people are at. And it reflects the same pattern. So a pretty basic requirement of an educational experience should be that the learner feels as though it meets their needs. And again, we're really not there. There are clearly some very positive experiences. So it's not to say that every child's experience is the same. There are clearly teachers and other adults in schools. We meet incredible learning support and PSAs in schools who are doing a lot of this work, as well as teachers. But it's more patchwork than pattern, I think, might be the way to think about it. And all members of SYP's learner panel took part, said that they were neutral in this statement. So this is the one that probably had the largest strongly disagree and disagree statements. So we're looking at over a third of learners who are disagreeing that they're having the best possible educational experience. That's a worry. So where does this take us? A recommendation from Professor Muir's education reform process was that we needed a renewed vision for education in Scotland. And the Scottish Government, you're probably aware of this, has launched a national discussion with a very, very tight sort of timeline. The positive news is that it's been facilitated by two independent people, Professors Carol Campbell and Alma Harris. From Children's Parliament's point of view, we're a bit disappointed at what's come out in terms of the format, the content of it. What we were really keen to do was to use Article 29 to do exactly what we had begun to do with SYP and Together, to say, this is your right. Where are we now? How does it feel now? And then think about what can we do to make it so. Unfortunately, they've not brought that clarity to it. But if you use this link in the slide, then what you'll find is all the toolkits, the products that Scottish Government have produced to help engage children, young people, parents and carers, and professionals. So people can have their say within this time frame. I would encourage people to do that. It is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to take all your learning, all the experiences of the children and young people that you work with or advocate for, and make sure that they're heard. And I know that Carol and Alma are very keen to hear about the experiences of children and young people who are not having the best experience. So they're very interested in the experiences of children and young people with disabilities, of those with care experience. These are the experiences that they do want and need to hear, as well as the experience of most children and young people. Just to finish with something, sometimes this can all feel overwhelming. It just feels so bureaucratic, so technical, so complicated. And I just encourage people always, especially when we're doing inputs at Children's Parliament, to maybe young people who are doing their HNC in childcare or whatever, or we just need to come back to basics sometimes. Children need to play and they need love. And if we can just provide these things, in some ways they're very simple, in some ways also very complex. If we start from there, if that's where we're at, then we can build on those and we can build and articulate our approaches through a rights-based lens. But that's the place we start. And these are the promises that we need to make to children who are taking part in any part of the education system. And finally, just a wee pointer to a couple of things that we've been involved in. People might be interested. We've got this particular programme called Dignity in School. We're working with early learning in primary schools to try and build those sectors' capacity to be repositories, to be hubs for human rights practice. And you can check out the hub. And if you're not already an Infeirtí, please join. On this call, I'm sure we all are Infeirtís. We all stand with children. We all want to work with them so they can speak for themselves. But when we need to, we can speak for them.